The silence inside the courtroom lasted barely 3 seconds, but for Prince Harry, it may have felt like an entire lifetime. A judge had just delivered the finding nobody inside the royal family was prepared to hear. Restricted papers, connected to Queen Elizabeth II, had remained concealed after they were supposed to be returned to controlled royal custody. Harry's name was now tied directly to that decision, transforming a private family fracture into something far more dangerous. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry did not move. In this fictional dramatization, the court had ruled that he knowingly retained a restricted collection of Elizabeth's private archival files after formal instructions required their return, breaching the custody rules governing those materials. His solicitor shifted closer, but the prince barely reacted. These were not ordinary letters or family souvenirs. Royal archival custody meant the controlled system used to protect sensitive crown records, and this collection contained confidential correspondence, handwritten annotations, succession-era briefing notes, and pages the late Queen had specifically ordered sealed from general circulation. That distinction mattered, because whoever controlled those pages also controlled private pieces of royal history, never intended for unrestricted access. Charles received the ruling away from the courtroom, and the effect was immediate. The king read the most damaging paragraph once, stopped, then returned to the beginning and read it again. He removed his glasses and placed them beside the page without speaking. Elizabeth had spent decades protecting the boundary between family emotion and constitutional responsibility. Yet now her private instructions had become the center of a crisis involving her grandson. The pain was personal, but the stakes were larger. If sealed royal records could be withheld after a formal return request, trust inside the monarchy itself could no longer be taken for granted. The timeline made everything worse. Court records established that palace archivists had raised questions about missing material months earlier, long before the dispute reached public attention. An archivist, meaning a professional responsible for preserving and tracking important historical records, had compared the returned collection against an internal inventory and found something disturbing. One handwritten notation indicated that several pages had been separated before the rest of the papers entered the normal return process. Someone had made a deliberate distinction between what went back and what stayed outside custody. Harry finally looked up when his solicitor said his name for the second time. The controlled expression disappeared. He leaned closer and asked only, "Which files did they identify?" The answer mattered, because the judgment had established what happened, but not why he had kept them. Who else knew they remained outside the archive? Or why Elizabeth had considered those particular pages sensitive enough to seal? And when that answer reached him, the crisis stopped being merely legal, because the names buried inside Elizabeth's restricted archive touched the people Harry once trusted most. For years, Queen Elizabeth had been more than Harry's grandmother. She had also been the one royal figure whose authority could temporarily quiet the bitterness between grandson and institution. Now, even after her death, her private wishes had placed Harry and Charles on opposite sides of an unforgiving divide. What the court had uncovered was no longer simply about custody of papers. It had become a test of memory, loyalty, and whether family trust had finally collapsed beyond repair. Harry felt the weight of that divide immediately. Some of Elizabeth's sealed files covered periods when his security, public duties, future role, and relationship with the royal household were being debated privately. A sealed file, in this context, meant material deliberately restricted from ordinary access because of its sensitivity. To him, those pages were not records. They contained conversations about his life and decisions that had shaped his place within the family. He told his legal team that he never believed such material should disappear into an archive where he might never see it again. Charles saw the same papers through a different lens. The king believed he had inherited a duty to protect Elizabeth's archival instructions and prevent crown records from becoming weapons in family disputes. Crown records are official or sensitive papers connected to the sovereign and the functioning of the monarchy. Speaking privately with William, He insisted that personal pain could not erase responsibility. Yet his voice softened when he admitted that Harry may have convinced himself he was protecting memories of his grandmother rather than defying her. William chose his words carefully. He asked whether Charles wanted the advisors brought in, but the monarch shook his head. Not yet. He stood beside the window holding a photocopied inventory, while the prince remained silent beside him. For several seconds, Elizabeth's name seemed to carry more weight than every legal phrase on the page. Then the inventory revealed something darker. One sealed index entry referred to an exceptional family contingency, suggesting Elizabeth had recorded instructions for a possible future rupture within the family. Another file contained notes made after a private meeting involving Harry years earlier, yet the court withheld the full contents from disclosure. That omission deepened the fear surrounding the archive, because whatever had been written there was sensitive enough to remain protected even now. Harry's refusal to surrender every page suddenly looked less like a simple act of possession and more like a decision rooted in one unresolved memory, and impossible for him to treat as history alone. To understand why he crossed that line, the story must return to the private encounter that made Elizabeth's archive feel personal to him. Long before judges, lawyers, or headlines entered the story, there had been one quiet royal evening that changed everything. It took place behind closed doors, with no press cameras and no public ceremony. Just Queen Elizabeth, Harry, and a small collection of papers she clearly did not want circulating freely. Years later, those who reconstructed the fictional timeline would identify that conversation as the point of no return, because it gave the documents an emotional meaning Harry never forgot. Elizabeth had always understood that some family arguments became more dangerous once written down. Certain highly personal working papers were therefore separated from ordinary records whenever they contained unresolved family disputes or sensitive constitutional observations. Restricted access meant those documents could only be seen by approved people under controlled conditions, rather than treated like ordinary private correspondence. Harry knew some of those papers concerned him directly, but he had never been given permanent ownership of them. That difference would later become crucial, because emotional connection and legal possession were never the same thing. Harry entered the private Windsor meeting, already carrying years of frustration. Shortly before one of his final major transitions away from royal duties, the Queen placed a sealed folder before him and allowed him to read a single page. He recognized references to conversations about his future, his place inside the family, and concerns surrounding what might happen if tensions deepened. Elizabeth watched him carefully before taking the folder back and saying that some family matters were not for today and not for public argument. She then directed that the papers return to restricted custody. Elizabeth did not soften the boundary. The monarch closed the folder herself, rested her palm against it, and reminded her grandson that affection could not erase responsibility. Harry heard something different beneath her warning. He believed she was trying to protect painful family discussions from becoming weapons later, especially if relations with the institution collapsed. That interpretation stayed with him long after he left Windsor, because he began to see the sealed pages not as records belonging to an archive, but as proof that his grandmother had understood fears he struggled to explain publicly. After Elizabeth's death, Harry received a mixed collection of personal effects and copied correspondence through an administrative handover. Buried among them were pages matching entries from the restricted folder. He recognized them immediately. Instead of returning every sheet with the rest, he separated several pages and asked that they remain outside the normal package until he could understand why the Queen had sealed them in the first place. That single decision turned memory into evidence. Years later, it would collide with a courtroom judgment, and when Charles finally demanded an explanation face-to-face, neither father nor son could hide behind advisors anymore. The confrontation everyone had tried to postpone finally happened without ceremony. No grand council table, no press statement, no carefully drafted palace language, just Charles facing Harry with Elizabeth's restricted inventory between them. For the king, the court ruling demanded accountability. For his son, the demand reopened years of resentment over who controlled royal history. And in that room, the argument moved beyond paperwork toward the deepest wound between them, whether either man still trusted the other. Charles had requested the meeting after studying the court's timeline twice. He wanted more than an explanation of how the papers stayed outside custody. He wanted to know why earlier requests had failed to bring everything back. The restricted inventory was the official list used to track sensitive archival material, including which papers were controlled and where they were supposed to be held. Harry understood the judgment had already damaged his position. He was no longer trying to deny possession. He wanted his father to understand why surrendering every page had felt, to him, like surrendering Elizabeth's private understanding of what he had lived through. Charles pushed the inventory across the table. Harry did not touch it. The king tapped one entry with his finger and finally asked, "Why did you keep them?" His son answered without looking away. After everything that had happened, he said, he could not simply hand over the only written record showing that Elizabeth had understood his fears before the family split hardened. The monarch's restraint cracked. He told Harry that his grandmother's sympathy did not give him permission to ignore her instructions. Harry pushed back harder. He said the institution had repeatedly taken family memories and treated them like controlled evidence, something to be locked away and interpreted later by other people. Then came the admission Charles had not expected. His son confirmed that after Elizabeth's death, he had read at least one of the restricted documents before deciding not to return it immediately. The king went still. Until that moment, he had believed Harry's decision might have been made without fully examining what had been retained. Harry then disclosed the sentence that had fixed itself in his mind. According to his documented account to his father during that private conversation, one page carried Elizabeth's handwritten warning that future disputes involving him should never be reduced to one side's account. He had taken that line as protection. Charles heard it as context, not permission. The wound was finally visible. The king now understood the fear behind his son's decision, but understanding could not erase the ruling. The argument had explained the motive without removing the breach, and outside that room, William and the royal advisors were already confronting a choice Charles could no longer postpone. By the next morning, emotion had collided with machinery. The monarchy could understand Harry's attachment to his grandmother, and still conclude that restricted material had crossed a boundary. That distinction became the heart of the palace response. Charles was now being asked to do something painfully unnatural: separate the father who understood his son's fear from the sovereign responsible for protecting the records of the late queen. And every option carried a personal cost. Charles returned again and again to Harry's explanation. He told William that he believed his son had acted from anger, fear, and distrust, not from any wish to damage Elizabeth's legacy. The court had established the breach, but the palace still controlled what came next. In this fictional account, restricted family archives meant sensitive royal papers kept under controlled access, while private working papers and institutional correspondence covered confidential material used in family and official decision-making. That mattered because the ruling decided what Harry had done, but the monarchy had to decide whether he could still be trusted near similar material in the future. William listened without interrupting, then gave the answer Charles knew was coming. The prince would one day inherit responsibility for the royal archive as future king, so every safeguard created now would eventually become part of his stewardship. He told his father that motive mattered, but boundaries mattered too. Once someone decided personal conviction outranked agreed protections, he said, every future confidential exchange became vulnerable. The monarch did not argue. He only looked down at the papers and admitted that understanding Harry did not make the decision easier. The pressure sharpened when advisors completed their confidential review. Their documented findings showed that Harry had retained the material longer than Charles had realized, including through at least one formal archive inquiry, asking where the missing pages were. Yet the same review found no evidence that his son had sold, published, or publicly distributed the restricted material. That distinction changed the possible response. The king could punish the breach, but he could not fairly portray Harry as someone who had tried to profit from Elizabeth's private legacy or deliberate public betrayal either. William finished speaking, and set his pen flat against the table. Charles stared at the restriction order, a formal instruction limiting access, then signed his name slowly. When he lifted the pen, he looked at the prince and said, "This is the line." Harry would lose direct unsupervised access to restricted royal archival material, but the palace would stop short of accusing him of commercial exploitation. For Harry, that signature changed everything, because the next message he received made clear that the consequence was no longer theoretical. Harry had known consequences were coming. Knowing did not make the message easier to read. The notice was short, formal, and devastatingly clear. Access he had once taken for granted would now require supervision and specific authorization. A grandson who had grown up inside the royal family had become someone the institution no longer trusted alone with its most sensitive historical record. For Harry, that sentence carried a punishment far deeper than protocol. Harry read the restriction notice slowly, then returned to the first paragraph, as if the wording might somehow change. Under Charles's decision, he could still request appropriate personal material, but restricted crown files connected to Elizabeth would only be available under controlled conditions. Crown files, in this fictional account, meant sensitive records belonging to the monarchy rather than to one individual family member. The distinction mattered because the returned papers had now been catalogued, sealed, and placed back into protected custody. The immediate fight over where the documents physically belonged was over. What remained was the harder question of trust. Harry lowered his phone onto the table and stared at it. Anger came first. He told Meghan that the decision made him feel as if memories of his grandmother had been turned into evidence against him, as though every private conversation now belonged to a system he no longer trusted. She listened, then challenged the feeling beneath his anger. Meghan reminded him that possession was not the same as remembrance. A folder could be taken away. A conversation with Elizabeth could not. Her words did not erase his frustration, but they forced him to confront something he had avoided from the beginning. Harry walked away, then returned minutes later and picked up the notice again. This time, one detail stopped him cold. The confirmation stated that Charles had personally approved the restriction rather than leaving the decision to palace advisors. The knowledge hurt more because the consequence came directly from his father. For several seconds, the prince said nothing. Meghan asked if he wanted to respond immediately. He shook his head. Then Harry reached the final paragraph. Charles had authorized certified copies of a limited category of purely personal correspondence once the archival review was complete. Certified copies were verified reproductions approved as accurate, while the originals remained protected. The concession was narrow, but its meaning was unmistakable. The king had drawn a boundary without trying to erase his son's personal connection to Elizabeth. Harry read that paragraph again. The restrictions still stood, and the humiliation remained. But the door had not closed completely. Inside that final sentence was an opening neither Harry nor Charles expected. And when father and son met again without lawyers or courtiers, the story would change direction. The second conversation was nothing like the first. There were no folders between them, no lawyers waiting beyond the door, and no argument about what the court had already decided. For the first time since the ruling, Charles and Harry spoke only as father and son. That did not erase the breach. It did something harder. It forced both men to admit what they had actually feared. Harry feared Elizabeth's understanding of him would disappear. Charles feared her private legacy would become another battlefield. Harry had asked for one final private meeting before making any public response, and Charles agreed on one condition: the legal finding would not be reopened or bargained away. Both already knew the practical outcome. The restricted files were back in protected custody, and Harry's unsupervised archival privileges had been suspended. Archival privileges meant permission to view controlled historical records without direct supervision. That mattered because the meeting was no longer about winning. It was about whether two men who had spent years doubting each other could finally explain the fear beneath their decisions. Harry spoke first. He admitted that separating the pages had been wrong, and that he should have disclosed immediately what remained outside the return package. Then his voice softened. "I thought if I handed everything back, I lost her version of what happened." Charles did not interrupt. The king understood that his son had begun treating Elizabeth's words as protection against being misunderstood. But he also knew fear had become an excuse for crossing a boundary. Harry finally admitted exactly that. His need to control what happened to those words had become stronger than his judgment. Charles answered with an admission of his own. He told Harry that the family had allowed suspicion to grow for so long that even ordinary safeguards had started to feel like threats. The monarch did not excuse what happened, but he accepted that the atmosphere surrounding his son had helped turn routine archival control into something Harry saw as hostile. Then came the detail the prince had not expected. Charles explained, during that private conversation, why he had authorized certified copies of purely personal letters. Elizabeth herself had drawn a distinction between crown material and intimate family correspondence, and he refused to erase that boundary simply because trust had failed. Harry fell silent before answering. He agreed voluntarily not to challenge the archival restriction and instructed his lawyers, through a documented written certification, to confirm that no remaining restricted material was held outside approved custody. Charles listened, then said quietly, "You never needed the papers to prove she loved you." Neither man spoke for several seconds. That exchange settled their private battle without pretending the damage had vanished. But beyond the family, judgment was only beginning, because outside palace walls, the ruling had already become a national spectacle. By sunrise, a family argument once contained inside locked rooms belonged to everyone. Commentators dissected Harry's motives. Critics focused on the breach. Supporters emphasized his grief and distrust. Yet the most powerful symbol was not a television argument or palace statement. It was a crowd standing outside Windsor beneath images of Queen Elizabeth, debating whether protecting someone's memory could ever justify ignoring the rules she herself had left behind. Harry watched the coverage with a frustration that quickly turned inward. The fictional court ruling dominated royal debate because it struck at two things the monarchy depends on: trust within the family and control over sensitive records. The palace answered with a short statement confirming that the disputed materials were secure and that updated archival safeguards had been put in place. Archival safeguards were simply the rules and controls used to protect restricted historical documents from improper access. The statement was meant to calm the crisis, but it could not calm the argument. Charles saw the same broadcasts and made a deliberate choice. Advisors urged stronger language, but the king refused to turn the palace response into a personal attack on his son. He insisted that the statement remain focused on the records, not Harry's character. That restraint mattered because the legal finding was serious, yet it did not say he had sold, published, or commercially distributed the restricted pages. A legal analyst stressed that distinction during a live broadcast, warning viewers not to confuse unlawful retention with deliberate public exploitation. Outside Windsor Castle, the divide became impossible to miss. Several dozen people gathered near the gates as television crews reported live. One newspaper front page shown to the cameras screamed, "The Queen's Files, Harry knew," while another carried the colder, sadder line, "A grandson's fatal mistake." Some people spoke of betrayal, others spoke of grief. Together, the two headlines captured the country's argument in a single moment. Harry finally turned off the television midway through another panel discussion. He had heard the word "hidden" repeated so often that years of family pain seemed reduced to one accusation. Yet he also knew his own secrecy had made that simplification possible. He picked up a handwritten card from Elizabeth, one that had never belonged to the restricted archive, read it once, and quietly slipped it back into its envelope. That simple act changed the emotional weight of the morning. The papers were back where they belonged, but Harry, Charles, and the monarchy could not return to who they had been before them, and the final verdict would not be about ownership alone, but about what trust had cost them all when private memory crossed into public royal responsibility. In the end, the crisis does not conclude with another explosive revelation. It concludes with something more permanent: consequence. Harry keeps his memories of Elizabeth, but loses the freedom to decide for himself how her restricted records should be handled. Charles protects his mother's instructions, but must accept that enforcing them against his own son carries a cost no royal order can erase. The files return to the archive. The legal dispute closes. What remains is the human verdict. Harry accepts what the ruling means without trying to reopen the fight. The restricted papers are fully accounted for and restored to protected custody, while he chooses not to pursue another challenge over possession. Charles's archival restriction remains in force, meaning personal royal status no longer guarantees unsupervised access to sensitive historical material. Archival restriction, in simple terms, is a formal limit on who may view protected records and under what conditions. That consequence matters because the crisis has permanently changed the level of institutional trust surrounding his son. Harry also reaches a harder conclusion about himself. His emotional connection to Elizabeth explained why the papers felt personal, but it did not justify keeping them outside the system she had chosen. Fear and mistrust had convinced him that surrendering control meant surrendering her understanding of him. Now he accepts that those were never the same thing. Charles, meanwhile, refuses to turn accountability into rejection. The king keeps the restrictions in place while preserving his son's access to legitimate personal correspondence, drawing a line between protecting the late queen's records and punishing Harry as family. William accepts the new safeguards as necessary, but the prince recognizes the warning beneath them. When trust disappears inside a family, letters, archives, and memories can become weapons. Elizabeth's so-called forbidden files never mattered most because of some final scandal hidden inside them. Their real power came from what they represented. To Harry, they were proof his grandmother understood him. To Charles, they were proof her instructions still deserved obedience. Harry finally receives the first approved copy of a purely personal letter from Elizabeth. He reads it alone, folds it carefully, and places it beside a family photograph. There is no secret folder this time. Nothing remains hidden from custody. The distinction is finally understood. The court exposed Harry's mistake, Charles enforced the consequence, and the family absorbed the damage. But the final lesson belonged to Elizabeth herself. Love could make a document precious, yet love never made anyone its owner. The files returned to the crown, the dispute ended, and Harry was left with something no archive could confiscate: the memory of the grandmother whose trust he had nearly mistaken for permission. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.